When you think of the war in North Africa, what comes to mind? Is it tanks rolling over endless dunes? Is it the famous generals Rommel and Montgomery locked in a giant chess match? That's the story we all know. But it's just the surface. That war was fought in a place so vast and so alien, it was like another planet. The real story isn't just about tanks. It's about water, it's about deception, ghosts in the sand, and men who learn to read the desert like a book. What about the army of dummy tanks that held a front line? Or the German commandos who spoke perfect Arabic and tried to turn the desert against the Allies? Did you know that some of the most crucial battles were won, not with bullets, but with simple water pipes? The war in the desert was a strange, brutal, and often surreal conflict. It was a place where a handful of men in converted trucks could hold a territory the size of Western Europe. A place where soldiers from India, New Zealand, France, and Poland fought and died thousands of miles from home, their stories often buried in the sand. These are the stories that don't make the headlines. They are the quiet, desperate, and ingenious tales of survival and warfare in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Number 17, how did a handful of scholars and explorers map the desert for war? Before the war, the great sand sea of the Libyan desert was a mystery. It was a place where maps had giant blank spots marked unexplored. For most armies, this was an impassable barrier. You couldn't fight a war there, but a small group of men knew better. They were not soldiers, they were Oxford and Cambridge academics, archaeologists, and explorers, men like Major Ralph Bagnold. Bagnold was a geologist and a pioneer of desert exploration. In the 1930s, he and his friends drove specially modified Ford Model A cars across thousands of miles of this impassable terrain. They learned how to navigate by the sun and stars. They figured out how to drive on soft sand by letting air out of their tires. They learned where to find the hidden wells. When the war started, the British Army suddenly needed this knowledge. So in June 1940, Bagnold formed a unit unlike any other, the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDGA. They were not a fighting force in the traditional sense. They were the eyes and ears of the army. Their job was to drive deep into enemy territory, hundreds of miles behind the lines, and just watch. They used modified Chevrolet trucks, stripped down and loaded with extra fuel, water, and machine guns. A typical patrol might be a dozen men in a few trucks. They would disappear into the desert for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They navigated with a sun compass. Bagnold himself had invented because magnetic compasses were unreliable in metal vehicles. Their work was incredibly dangerous, but the enemy wasn't just the Italian or German forces. The real enemy was the desert itself. If a truck broke down, you couldn't just call for a tow. A broken axle hundreds of miles from base was a death sentence. Getting lost meant you would run out of water and die of thirst. The LRDGA became masters of survival. They learned to repair their vehicles with scraps of wire and ingenuity. They rationed their water with an iron discipline. A man might get 1 gallon a day for drinking, cooking, and washing. They drove at night to avoid the heat in enemy aircraft, navigating by stars. During the day, they would hide their trucks under camouflage nets, trying to blend in with the rocks and sand. The intelligence they gathered was priceless. An LRG patrol hiding near a main road could count every enemy truck, tank, and soldier that went past. They would radio this information back to headquarters in Cairo. Generals could then see exactly what the enemy was planning. The LRDGA also acted as a guide service for other special forces, like the newly formed Special Air Service SAS. When David Stirling needed to get his men to an enemy airfield for a raid, he called on the LRDGA to be his desert taxi. They knew the secret paths, the hidden routes that bypassed enemy patrols. As historian Saul David notes in his book The Force, the LRDGA's contribution to Allied victory in the desert was completely out of proportion to their tiny numbers. They were never more than a few hundred men, yet they effectively mapped and controlled an area larger than France. They turned the desert from an obstacle into a highway for secret operations. They proved that in this new kind of war, knowledge of the land was a weapon as powerful as any tank. What do we still not know? How many LRG patrols were simply lost to the desert, their fates completely unknown? Did their intelligence reports ever contain deliberate misinformation planted by nomadic tribes they encountered? What personal, unrecorded maps and notes did these men carry, and were any of them ever recovered from lost vehicles? But number 16, did German commandos and Arab dress almost change the war? The German military had its own version of a special operations unit, and they were just as unorthodox as the RAG. They were called the Brandenburgers. This was a unit under the control of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. What made them unique was their recruitment. They sought out men who were fluent in foreign languages and familiar with foreign cultures. They wanted soldiers who could blend in, who could pass as the enemy. In North Africa, this meant finding men who could speak Arabic, who understood local customs, and who could survive in the desert. Their missions were audacious. They would dress in British uniforms, drive captured British trucks, and simply drive through enemy checkpoints. They would use perfect English and forged documents to bluff their way through. Their goal was sabotage and intelligence gathering. They aimed to seize key bridges, disrupt supply lines, and create chaos behind the front lines. One of their most famous and ambitious operations was Operation Salam in the summer of 1942. This was a long-range penetration mission, similar to what the LRAG did. A small team led by a charismatic officer, Captain Laszlo Almasi, the real-life figure behind the English Patient, was tasked with delivering 2 German spies to Cairo. Almasi was a Hungarian desert explorer who knew the Libyan desert better than almost any European. His team used captured American trucks and wore a mix of German and British uniforms. They drove over 2,000 miles through territory held by the British and Free French, deep into Egypt. They navigated through the treacherous Qattara Depression, a vast area of salt marshes and soft sand considered impassable by both sides. Almasi's knowledge allowed them to find a way through. They successfully dropped off the 2 spies, Johann Epler and Heinrich Stansted, near Cairo. The spies' mission, codenamed Operation Condor, was to make contact with Egyptian nationalist groups and send intelligence back to Rommel's headquarters. For a short time, it seemed like a brilliant success. The spies set up a radio in a houseboat on the Nile and began transmitting. But the plan fell apart. The spies were more interested in the high life of Cairo than in careful espionage. They spent money lavishly, drawing attention to themselves. British counterintelligence, MI6, was already on their trail. The radio code they used was based on the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and British codebreakers quickly cracked it. Epler was eventually captured after a series of blunders, including a dalliance with a belly dancer, who was also a British informant. The intelligence they sent was minimal, so while the Brandenburgers' skill in getting them to Cairo was remarkable, the espionage part of the mission was a failure. The story is detailed in books like The Spy Who Fell to Earth by John Epler himself and analyzed by military historians like James Lucas. It shows the strange blend of incredible competence and foolish mistakes that often characterize these secret operations. The Brandenburgers proved they could go anywhere, but their impact was limited by the missions they were given. What are the unanswered questions about these units? How many other, smaller Brandenburger operations were successful but never recorded? Did they manage to recruit local agents who were never discovered? Was there a secret German supply dump hidden in a desert oasis that has never been found? Number 15. Could an army of dummies win a real battle? By the autumn of 1942, the British 8th Army was preparing for a massive offensive at a place called El Alamein. This was to be the turning point of the Desert War, but they had a problem. The German and Italian lines were strong, and a direct assault would be costly. The British commander, Bernard Montgomery, needed an element of surprise. The question was, how do you hide an army of 700 tanks and thousands of men in a flat, open desert? The answer was, you don't hide it. You make the enemy look in the wrong direction. This led to one of the most elaborate deception plans in military history, Operation Bertrand. The man in charge of the visual trickery was a professional stage magician named Jasper Mascaline. He and his team, known as the Magic Gang, were tasked with creating illusions on a massive scale. The core of the plan was to make the German command believe the main British attack was coming in the south, and that it would happen later than planned. The real attack was planned for the north. To do this, they had to hide the real buildup in the north and create a fake buildup in the south. In the south, they built a phantom army. They used plywood and canvas to construct hundreds of fake tanks. From the air, these spoof tanks looked real. They even built a fake water pipeline miles long to suggest a major force was preparing to stay there for a long time. They used clever tricks to create the illusion of activity. They would drive a few real tanks around in circles to kick up dust, making it look like a whole armored division was on the move. They broadcast fake radio traffic to simulate the chatter of a large headquarters. At night, they used lights to mimic the positions of a huge vehicle park. Meanwhile, in the north, they had to hide the real army. This was even harder. You can't just hide 1,000 tanks. So they disguised them. They built canvas covers called sun shields that could be placed over a tank. making it look like a regular supply truck from the air. From a distance, an entire armored brigade looked like a bunch of harmless lorries. Artillery guns were hidden in the same way. Supply dumps, with thousands of tons of shells and fuel, were camouflaged to look like random, empty patches of desert. This was all timed perfectly. Every night, more real tanks and guns would move into the northern sector. The trucks they replaced would then be driven south to join the fake army, ensuring the enemy's aerial reconnaissance photos showed the same number of vehicles in the area each day. The deception, as documented by historians like John Latimer in Alamein, worked perfectly. German intelligence was completely fooled. They believed the main Allied force was in the south and was not yet ready to attack, when the real assault began on the night of October 23rd, 1942, with a massive artillery barrage in the north. The German command was taken by complete surprise. The bulk of their armored forces were in the wrong place. By the time they realized their mistake and tried to move their tanks north, it was too late. Operation Bertram didn't fire a single shot, but it played a crucial role in one of the most decisive battles of the war. It proved that sometimes the best weapon is a good story, but what parts of the story are still hidden? Were there other smaller deception operations that we know nothing about? Did any German reconnaissance pilots suspect the truth but have their reports dismissed by superiors? How many of the magic gang's techniques were classified after the war and have never been revealed? Number 14, what happens when paratroopers fight as infantry in hell? The Italian army in North Africa is often unfairly remembered. They are sometimes portrayed as unmotivated and poorly equipped. While they did face serious equipment and leadership problems, many Italian units fought with incredible courage and tenacity. None more so than the 185th Parachute Division Folger. The Folgor, which means thunderbolt, were an elite unit. Well, they were volunteers, highly trained and motivated. They were supposed to be part of the invasion of Malta, an operation that was ultimately canceled. Instead, in the summer of 1942, they were sent to the desert to fight as regular infantry. They arrived at the El Alamein front without any of their own transport. They had no trucks, no tanks, no armored cars. They had their rifles, machine guns, and some excellent anti-tank guns. But their most potent weapon was their spirit. They were given a section of the southern front to defend. It was a barren, rocky landscape, exposed to the blistering sun and constant British artillery fire. The men of the Folgor dug in and prepared to fight. They used their ingenuity to make up for their lack of equipment. They became masters at camouflage and at creating deep, well-protected foxholes in the hard ground. When the British launched their offensive, Operation Lightfoot, the main attack in the south, fell directly on the Folgor's positions. The British forces, including armored divisions, expected to roll right over them. They were wrong. The Italian paratroopers fought with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. They let the British tanks get close, then knocked them out at point-blank range with their 47mm anti-tank guns and sticky bombs. When the British infantry advanced, the Folgor met them with withering machine gun fire and counterattacks with bayonets and hand grenades. For days, they held their ground against overwhelming odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly pounded by artillery and air attacks. Their bravery was noted even by their enemies. A British report from the battle stated the Italian Folgor division has resisted beyond every limit of human sacrifice. By the end of the battle, the Folgor had been practically destroyed. Of the 5,000 men who started the battle, only a few hundred remained. They had lost almost all of their officers. When the order for the general Axis retreat came, the survivors had no trucks to escape in. They began to walk. They were eventually surrounded and forced to surrender, but only after running out of ammunition and water. Their commander, General Enrico Frattini, surrendered with the words, "We have run out of ammunition." The story of the Folgor, documented in Italian military histories and memoirs like Come Leon, like Lions, is a powerful reminder that the experience of war is about more than just the winning side. It's a story of human endurance and courage in the face of impossible conditions. What mysteries remain about their stand? Did small groups of Folgor soldiers refuse the surrender order and attempt to walk back to Italian lines, their fates unknown? What personal diaries or letters from these men survive, and what do they tell us about their motivations? Were there unrecorded acts of battlefield camaraderie between the Folgor and the British soldiers? They fought so fiercely. Number 13, why did a forgotten oasis hold up an entire army? In the vast emptiness of the Libyan desert, a small dot on the map called Bir Hakeim became a symbol of defiance. It was a desolate spot, an old abandoned oasis well. There was nothing there but sand, rocks, and a few ruined buildings. But in May 1942, it was the southern anchor of the Allied defensive line, and it was defended by a unit that had everything to prove the First Free French Brigade. These were the men who had refused to surrender after the fall of France in 1940. They had rallied to General Charles de Gaulle and were determined to keep fighting. They were a diverse group: Frenchmen, soldiers from France's African colonies, and even members of the French Foreign Legion. Their commander was General Pierre Koenig. He was given the impossible task of holding Bir Hakeim. His force of about 3,700 men was surrounded by minefields, but they were isolated and exposed. When Rommel launched his offensive, Operation Theseus, his plan was to sweep his armored divisions around the southern end of the Allied line, crush Bir Hakeim quickly, and then attack the main British forces from the rear. He expected the French to collapse in a matter of hours. He sent the Italian Ariete Armored Division to take the position. The Italians attacked, but the French held their ground. They used their 75mm artillery guns, old but effective, as anti-tank weapons. They knocked out dozens of Italian tanks and threw the attack into confusion. Rommel was furious. He realized he had underestimated the defenders. He diverted German units, including the 15th Panzer Division, to crush the French garrison. For the next 2 weeks, Bir Hakeim was under constant siege. It was pounded by artillery. It was bombed relentlessly by Stuka dive bombers. The German infantry tried to storm the French positions again and again. But the defenders of Bir Hakeim refused to break. They lived in their foxholes, enduring the heat, the flies, the constant shelling, and the growing shortage of water and ammunition. The defense of Bir Hakeim is vividly captured in books like The War in the Desert by Richard Collier. It became a daily struggle for survival. The stand of the Free French was more than just a brave defense. It was strategically vital. Like, by holding up Rommel's divisions for 2 critical weeks, they completely disrupted his timetable. It gave the main British 8th Army time to regroup and organize a new defensive line. Without the delay at Bir Hakeim, Rommel might have succeeded in his plan and destroyed the 8th Army. But the garrison could not hold out forever. By early June, they were almost out of water and ammunition. Koenig received the order to evacuate. On the night of June 10th, under the cover of darkness, the survivors fought their way out through the German lines in a desperate and chaotic breakout. They suffered heavy casualties, but about 2,600 men made it back to British lines. Their defiance had a huge impact on morale. The Free French had proven they were a serious fighting force. They had shown the world that France was not defeated. But what questions linger? How did the morale of the diverse units within the French brigade hold up under such extreme pressure? Were there secret, unrecorded negotiations for surrender between German and French officers during lulls in the fighting? What impact did the experience at Bir Hakeim have on the post-war politics of France and its colonies? Number 12 was the most important weapon in the deserts, a simple pipe. The Desert War was a war of movement. Tanks, trucks, and men needed to cover huge distances, and all of them needed one thing more than anything else: water. The North African coast has very little fresh water. For a modern army of hundreds of thousands of men, this was a logistical nightmare. You can't fight if your soldiers are dying of thirst. You can't run your vehicles if the radiators boil dry. The battle for water was just as important as the battles with tanks and guns. Both sides struggled with this problem. They used tanker trucks to haul water to the front lines, a slow and inefficient process. They tried to capture enemy wells and cisterns. The British, however, came up with a more ambitious solution. As they pushed the Axis forces westwards across Libya after the victory at El Alamein, they knew they would outrun their supply lines. The port of Tobruk had been heavily damaged, and bringing in supplies by sea was difficult. They needed a way to get massive quantities of water and fuel to the front, which was advancing dozens of miles every day. The answer was a pipeline. This was a monumental engineering challenge. Royal Engineers and Pioneer Corps units worked around the clock in punishing conditions to lay hundreds of miles of steel pipe across the desert. This wasn't just one pipeline, it was a whole network. One system for water, another for gasoline. They laid pipe from supply depots near the coast all the way to the forward airfields and army positions. They built pumping stations every few dozen miles to keep the fluids moving. As the front line moved forward, the engineers would extend the pipeline. It was a constant race against time. They had to deal with the heat, the sandstorms, and the threat of enemy air attacks. The work is documented in the official histories of the Royal Engineers. It was grueling, unglamorous work, but it was absolutely essential. While the headlines were about the tank battles, this quiet, steady work in the rear was what made those battles possible. The pipeline system was a huge strategic advantage. It meant the 8th Army had a reliable supply of water, which kept the soldiers healthy and the vehicles running. It also freed up thousands of trucks that would have been needed to haul water, allowing them to carry ammunition and food instead. The fuel pipeline, known as the petrol, oil, and lubricants, or POL system, was just as vital. It allowed the Royal Air Force to set up forward airfields close to the front, giving them air superiority. The German forces, by contrast, relied on a fragile supply line across the Mediterranean and then a long truck journey to the front. Their chronic fuel shortages were a major reason for their ultimate defeat. The simple steel pipe was a weapon the German command could not counter. It was a triumph of engineering and logistics, the unglamorous foundation of the Allied victory. What remains unknown about this feat of engineering? How many men died from heat stroke and accidents while building these pipelines, their deaths unrecorded in the main casualty lists? Were there attempts at sabotage by Axis special forces that were successfully thwarted and kept secret? Are there still sections of this wartime pipeline buried beneath the sands of Libya and Egypt today? Number 11. How does an army learn to fight by losing? When American soldiers landed in North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, they were confident. They were well equipped, well fed, and they believed they were ready for war. They were about to get a very harsh lesson. The U.S. Army of 1942 was a Green Army. It hadn't fought a major battle against a first-rate opponent yet. Their training had been based on theory, not on the brutal reality of combat. In February 1943, they came face-to-face with the veterans of the German Afrika Korps at a place in Tunisia called Kasserine Pass. The result was a disaster. The American forces were spread out, their command structure was confused, and their leaders made a series of critical mistakes. The Germans, led by the experienced Erwin Rommel, saw an opportunity. They launched a surprise attack through the pass, hitting the unprepared American units hard. The German tanks, the Panzer IVs, and the new Tigers were superior to the American M3 Lee and M4 Sherman tanks of the time. The German 88mm anti-tank gun was terrifyingly effective. American units were overrun. Some fought bravely, but many broke and fled. Communications collapsed. For a few days, it was a complete rout. The Germans pushed deep into the American rear, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of equipment. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a humiliating defeat for the U.S. Army. It was a wake-up call. The story is told in powerful detail in Rick Atkinson's book, An Army at Dawn. The battle exposed every weakness in the American force. Their tactics were poor. Their equipment was, in some cases, inadequate. Their leadership, from the platoon level all the way up to the corps commander, had failed. But the defeat also became a turning point. The U.S. Army learned from its mistakes, and it learned fast. The disaster at Kasserine led to sweeping changes. Ineffective commanders were fired. General Lloyd Fredendall, the U.S. II Corps commander who had directed the battle from a command post far to the rear, was replaced by the aggressive and demanding General George S. Patton. Patton immediately began to instill a new sense of discipline and fighting spirit. The Army changed its tactics. They learned that they couldn't just fight a battle of maneuver, they needed to coordinate their infantry, artillery, and tanks much more effectively. They learned the hard way about German battlefield tactics, like the use of anti-tank screens. The lessons learned in the Tunisian mountains, paid for in blood, would transform the U.S. Army. By the time they invaded Sicily and Italy later that year, they were a different force. They were now a seasoned professional army that knew how to fight. Kasserine Pass was a defeat, but it was arguably the most important battle the U.S. Army fought in the entire war, because it taught them how to win. But what are the lingering questions from this debacle? How much did inter-allied friction between the British, French, and Americans contribute to the initial chaos? What were the conversations like in the German high command as they saw the weakness of their new enemy? And did they miss an opportunity for an even bigger victory? What happened to the thousands of American prisoners taken, and what were their experiences in Axis POW camps? Number 10. Who were the desert hawks that tamed the sky? The war in the desert wasn't just fought on the ground. The sky was another battlefield. For much of the early campaign, the German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber was the terror of the sky. The wailing siren on the Stuka was designed to create psychological terror, and it worked. Allied soldiers on the ground felt helpless as these planes screamed down to deliver their bombs with deadly accuracy. But the Allies had a weapon of their own, a rugged and tough American-built fighter plane, the Curtiss P-40. In the hands of the British, Australian, South African, and New Zealand pilots of the Desert Air Force, it was known as the Kitty Hawk. The Kitty Hawk was not the best fighter in the world. It couldn't climb as fast or turn as well as the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. But it was tough, it could take a lot of punishment and still bring its pilot home. It was also heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, which could tear apart an enemy plane or truck. The pilots of the Desert Air Force developed tactics to play to the P-40's strengths. They learned to avoid getting into turning dogfights with the more nimble German fighters. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving on their targets from a higher altitude, firing a quick burst, and then using their speed to get away. The pilots of squadrons like the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 3 Squadron became legends. They lived a harsh life on primitive, dusty airfields. They flew multiple missions a day in the intense heat. Their planes were constantly plagued by sand, which got into the engines and wore down parts. But they became masters of their craft. They learned to work closely with the army on the ground. This was a new kind of air warfare. Instead of just fighting other planes, the Kitty Hawks became fighter bombers. They would act as a kind of flying artillery for the ground troops. A Cobb rank system was developed, where flights of Kitty Hawks would circle over the battlefield, waiting for a call for help from the army. When a ground controller saw a German tank column or a strong point holding up the advance, he could radio the Kitty Hawks, and within minutes, they would be diving down to attack with bombs and machine guns. This close air support was devastatingly effective. It broke up German counterattacks and demoralized their troops. The story of these pilots is told in books like Desert Warriors by Russell Brown. One of the most famous pilots was Clive Killer Caldwell, an Australian ace who became the highest-scoring P-40 pilot of the war. These men, in their tough American planes, wrestled control of the skies away from the German and Italian air forces. They neutralized the threat of the Stuka and made it dangerous for any Axis vehicle to move during the day. They proved that air power, when used intelligently and in coordination with ground forces, could be a decisive factor in the Desert War. What aspects of this air war are still obscure? How much of the Desert Air Force's success was due to superior maintenance and logistics compared to their Axis counterparts? Were there informal truces or codes of conduct between opposing fighter pilots, as have been reported in other theaters of war? What psychological toll did the constant flying and combat take on these pilots, and how many were grounded, not by enemy fire, but by mental exhaustion? Number 9. Could a doctor's needle save more lives than a general's plan? In the Desert War, the enemy wasn't just the other army, it was the environment itself. The heat, the flies, the poor sanitation, and the nature of the wounds created a medical crisis. A soldier wounded in the desert faced a grim future. The distances were huge, and getting a wounded man from the front line to a hospital could take days. Infection was a constant threat. A simple wound could easily become fatal. But the North African campaign also became a laboratory for incredible medical innovation. The doctors, surgeons, and medics of the Allied armies worked miracles in impossible conditions. One of the biggest challenges was shock and blood loss. In previous wars, a soldier with a severe bleeding wound would likely die. But in the desert, doctors began to use blood transfusions on a massive scale right near the front lines. They set up mobile blood banks. They pioneered the use of dried blood plasma, which could be transported easily and then reconstituted with sterile water. A wounded man could now receive a life-saving transfusion in a field dressing station just a few miles from the fighting. This one innovation saved thousands of lives. The work of pioneers like the New Zealander Dr. Douglas Robb was instrumental in developing these forward resuscitation units. Another major breakthrough was in the treatment of infection. This was a war fought just before the age of penicillin became widespread. But early versions of sulfa drugs were available. These wonder drugs could stop infections like gangrene, which had been a death sentence in previous conflicts. Surgeons also developed new techniques. They learned that in the dirty, contaminated environment of the desert, it was better not to stitch up a large wound immediately. Instead, they would clean it, pack it with gauze, and leave it open for a few days, a technique called delayed primary closure. This allowed any infection to drain before the wound was closed, dramatically reducing the rate of serious complications. The organization of medical care was also revolutionized. The concept of triage sorting casualties based on the severity of their injuries was refined. Mobile surgical units, basically operating rooms in trucks, were brought right up behind the advancing army. This meant a severely wounded soldier could be operated on by a skilled surgeon within hours or even minutes of being injured. Historians like John C. Hemeter have documented how these advances in military medicine had a profound impact. The chance of a wounded Allied soldier surviving in North Africa was significantly higher than in any previous war. The quiet, dedicated work of the medical corps was a true secret weapon. The generals planned the battles, but it was the doctors and medics who saved the army. What medical mysteries from this period remain unsolved? How did the psychological trauma of combat, what we now call PTSD, manifest in soldiers, and how was it treated by 1940s medicine? Were there undocumented experiments with new drugs or surgical techniques on captured enemy wounded? What traditional remedies learned from the local population were used by soldiers when official medical supplies ran out? Number 8. What do you do when your best tank isn't good enough? In early 1942, the British Army in the desert was in trouble. Their tanks were outclassed by the German panzers. The British cruiser tanks were fast, but had thin armor and a small 2-pounder gun that was almost useless against German armor. The infantry tanks, like the Matilda, were heavily armored but slow. The British desperately needed a tank that could compete with the Panzer III and Panzer IV. The problem was their own new designs weren't ready. The solution came from America. It was the M3 medium tank. The British called it the Grant. The M3 Grant was a strange-looking machine. It was tall, with a high profile that made it an easy target in the flat desert. Its main weapon, a powerful 75mm gun, was mounted in the side of the hull, not in the turret. This meant the whole tank had to turn to aim the main gun, which was a huge tactical disadvantage. The turret on top only housed a smaller 37mm gun. It was a deeply flawed design, a stopgap measure rushed into production. But it had two things. The British desperately needed a 75mm gun that could fire a high explosive shell and could knock out German tanks, and reliability. It was mechanically sound, unlike many of the British tanks of the period. When the first Grants arrived in the desert in the spring of 1942, they came as a complete shock to the Germans. For the first time, the British had a tank that could engage the panzers at a distance. In their first major action at the Battle of Gazala, the Grants caused panic among the German tank crews. They didn't know what had hit them. The 75mm gun could destroy a Panzer IV from over 1,000 yards away. This new American tank helped to stabilize the front and gave the British armored crews a much-needed morale boost. But the flaws were still there. The high silhouette and the side-mounted gun were major problems. German 88mm anti-tank guns could pick off the tall Grants from a long way off. The crews knew they were in a compromised machine. They learned to fight it cleverly using hold-down positions, where they would hide the body of the tank behind a ridge, exposing only the turret. But it was always a compromise. The Grant story is a perfect example of the desperate arms race that was the Desert War. It wasn't the best tank, but it was the tank they had. As documented in tank histories by authors like David Fletcher, the Grant filled a critical gap until the far superior American M4 Sherman tank arrived in large numbers later in 1942. The Grant was a clumsy, awkward, but ultimately vital piece of equipment. It was the ugly duckling that saved the day, proving that sometimes good enough is all you need to keep fighting. What do we not know about the crew's experiences? What unofficial modifications did tank crews make to their Grants in the field to improve their chances of survival? How did the German tank commanders adapt their tactics specifically to counter the Grant's strange design? Are there personal letters or diaries from Grant crew members that describe the psychological stress of fighting in a tank they knew was a flawed design? Number 7. Who really held the scrap heap fortresses? The port city of Tobruk in Libya was a key strategic prize. Whoever held Tobruk had a deep water port to bring in supplies. In April 1941, as the German Afrika Korps swept across the desert, they bypassed Tobruk, leaving it an isolated pocket of Allied resistance deep behind their lines. The garrison was made up mostly of the Australian 9th Division. They were surrounded, cut off, and subjected to constant attacks. The German propaganda machine contemptuously called them the Rats of Tobruk. The Australians adopted the name as a badge of honor. The defense of Tobruk was a brutal, grinding siege that lasted for 241 days. The Australians, along with a brigade of British artillery and a regiment of Indian cavalry, held a defensive perimeter about 30 miles long. This wasn't a modern fortress. The defenses were a series of concrete bunkers and trenches built by the Italians, which the Australians improved and expanded. Life in the perimeter was hell. The soldiers lived in dugouts and caves to escape the constant shelling and bombing. The heat was intense, water was strictly rationed and tasted of salt, food was monotonous, mostly canned bully beef. Flies were a constant plague, spreading disease, but the rats refused to be broken. They were aggressive defenders. They didn't just sit in their trenches, they patrolled relentlessly, dominating the no man's land between the lines. They conducted raids on German and Italian positions, keeping the enemy off balance. Their attitude was one of grim determination and a dark, cynical humor. They turned Tobruk into a scrap heap fortress, using captured enemy equipment and improvising weapons. Their defense was a major problem for Rommel. He couldn't ignore them because the garrison threatened his supply lines. He had to divert a significant portion of his army to contain them, forces he desperately needed for his advance into Egypt. Often overlooked in the story are the contributions of other units. The 18th King Edward VII's own cavalry, a unit of the Indian Army, played a vital role. They were mechanized, using armored carriers, and they held a critical sector of the line. Their story is part of the larger, often untold, story of the massive contribution of the Indian Army to the Allied war effort. Over 2 million men from the Indian subcontinent served in the war. Later in the siege, many of the exhausted Australians were evacuated by sea and replaced by the Polish Carpathian Rifle Brigade and the British 70th Infantry Division. The defense of Tobruk was a truly multinational effort. The siege, detailed in books like Tobruk by Peter Fitzsimons, was a major psychological victory for the Allies. It was the first time the German ground forces had been decisively stopped since the war began. The defenders of this dusty, battered port proved that the legendary Afrika Korps was not invincible. What questions about the siege remain unanswered? What was the true extent of the black market and unofficial trading that went on between different Allied units inside the besieged fortress? How did the relationship between the Australian, British, Indian, and Polish soldiers evolve during the shared hardship? Are there undiscovered diaries from German or Italian soldiers on the siege lines that would give us a better understanding of their perspective on the stubborn defenders? Number 6. Was a belly dancer the key to Cairo's secrets? While armies fought in the desert, another war was being waged in the shadows of cities like Cairo. This was a war of spies, secret codes, and deception. In 1942, as Rommel's army pushed towards Egypt, the German High Command launched Operation Condor. The plan was to insert 2 spies into Cairo to gather intelligence on British military strength and plans. The 2 agents were Johann Epler and Heinrich Stanstead. Epler was an interesting choice. He had grown up in Egypt and spoke fluent Arabic and English. He had a deep knowledge of the culture. The 2 spies were inserted into Egypt by the Brandenburger Commandos, as mentioned earlier. They set themselves up in a houseboat on the Nile and began their work. Epler, using his old contacts, tried to build a network of informants. Their main tool for communication was a radio, and their code was based on Daphne du Maurier's novel, Rebecca. It seemed like a classic spy story. However, the reality was far from glamorous. The spies had a taste for the high life. They were given a large amount of money, both genuine and counterfeit British pounds, and they spent it freely in Cairo's bars and nightclubs. This lavish spending quickly attracted attention. British counterintelligence, specifically the Security Intelligence Middle East SIME, was on the case. But the spy's biggest mistake was Epler's involvement with a dancer named Hekmat Fahmy. Epler became infatuated with her and showered her with gifts. He also talked too much. He revealed details of his mission to her. What he didn't know was that some of the people in Cairo's nightlife scene were working as informants for the British. The British were also monitoring radio transmissions. They picked up the spies' signals and, using a copy of Rebecca, their codebreakers at Bletchley Park quickly deciphered the messages. The end of Operation Condor was almost comical. The British decided to arrest the spies. They tracked Epler to the houseboat. The story, as Epler himself told it in his memoirs, involves a raid, a chase, and his eventual capture. The intelligence they had managed to send was of limited value. The operation was a complete failure. It's a story that highlights the vast gap between the fantasy and reality of espionage. While the idea of a German spy charming secrets out of a belly dancer makes for a good movie plot, the truth, as analyzed by intelligence historians like Richard Deacon, was a story of incompetence, poor tradecraft, and overconfidence. It also showed the effectiveness of the British counterintelligence network in the Middle East. But what parts of this spy story are still in the dark? Was Hekmat Fahmy a willing British agent from the start, or was she just an informant who got caught up in events? How much of the money provided to the spies was deliberately counterfeit, and was this a sign that their own command didn't fully trust them? Were there other lower-level German spy networks operating in Egypt at the time that were never caught? Number 5, could the wind itself be an enemy? Soldiers in the desert fought against more than just other men. They fought against the desert itself, and one of its most fearsome weapons was the wind. In North Africa, there is a seasonal wind that blows up from the south, from the heart of the Sahara. It's called the Hamsin in Egypt and the Ghibli in Libya. It's not a gentle breeze. It's a hot, dry, sand-laden gale. When the Hamsin blew, it was like a biblical plague. The sky would turn a dark, angry orange. The sun would be blotted out. The air would become thick with fine dust that got into everything. For the soldiers, a Khamsin storm was a unique form of misery. The temperature would soar to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 Celsius. The air was so dry it would crack your lips and burn your throat. The fine sand would get in your eyes, your ears, your mouth. It would get into your food, making every meal a gritty ordeal. It would seep through the fabric of your clothes and rub your skin raw. There was no escape. Men would huddle in their tents or tanks, but the dust always found a way in. It made it impossible to sleep, impossible to think. It frayed nerves and shortened tempers. Memoirs from desert veterans, like those collected in The War in the Desert by James Holland, are filled with descriptions of the pure physical and mental exhaustion caused by these storms. The Khamsin was also a military factor. It could halt entire operations. Visibility would drop to near zero. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you. This made navigation impossible, a grounded aircraft. Flying in a sandstorm was suicidal. It also played havoc with equipment. The fine, abrasive sand got into engines, tank tracks, and the mechanisms of machine guns. Its weapons would jam, vehicle engines would overheat and seize up. A sandstorm could cause more damage to an army's vehicles than a week of fighting. Both sides learned to use the Khamsin. A storm could provide excellent cover for a surprise attack or a secret withdrawal. A patrol could use the low visibility to sneak past enemy lines, but it was a double-edged sword. The same storm that covered your advance could also make you lose your way and wander into a minefield. The wind was a neutral but powerful force in the desert war. It didn't care which uniform you wore. It was a reminder that in this vast, ancient landscape, the armies of men were just temporary, fragile things. The real power belonged to the desert. What are the unrecorded stories of the Khamsin? How many soldiers, lost from their units during a storm, were never seen again, their bodies buried by the shifting sands? Did either side attempt to develop technology or tactics specifically to fight effectively during a sandstorm? And were these experiments successful? What long-term health effects did repeated exposure to these dust storms have on the veterans of the campaign? Number 4, how do you fuel a war across the sea? We often focus on the tanks and the generals, but the Desert War was, above all, a war of logistics. It was a war of supply, and for the German and Italian forces in North Africa, their supply line was their Achilles heel. Everything they needed, fuel, ammunition, food, tanks, spare parts, had to come from Europe, and it had to come across the Mediterranean Sea. This stretch of water was controlled by the British Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, operating from the island of Malta. Malta was a thorn in the side of the Axis. It sat right in the middle of their supply route from Italy to Libya. From Malta, British submarines, torpedo bombers, and reconnaissance planes could attack the Axis convoys. Every tanker carrying fuel and every freighter carrying supplies was a target. The journey was incredibly dangerous. The Axis tried to protect their convoys with warships and fighter planes, but the British attacks were relentless. A huge percentage of the supplies sent from Italy never reached North Africa. They ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Historians like Corelli Barnett, in his book The Desert Generals, argue that this single factor was the primary reason for the Axis' defeat in the desert. Rommel was a brilliant tactical commander, but he was constantly hampered by a lack of supplies. His offensives would often grind to a halt, not because his troops were defeated, but because his tanks ran out of fuel. He would capture vast amounts of British supplies after a victory, and this liberated material would be essential to keeping his army moving. But it was never enough. The German High Command never fully committed the resources needed to either neutralize Malta or establish a secure supply line. They were focused on the war in Russia and considered North Africa a secondary theater. This created a constant state of crisis for the Afrika Korps. They were an army living on a shoestring. They had to be incredibly resourceful. Their mechanics became experts at cannibalizing wrecked vehicles for spare parts. They used captured British trucks and guns, but they could never overcome the fundamental problem. The British, on the other hand, had a much longer but more secure supply line. Thus, they could bring in supplies all the way from Britain and America, around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and up through the Red Sea to Egypt. It was a long journey, but it was safe. This meant that the 8th Army could be built up into a massive, well-supplied force, while Rommel's army was slowly starved. The decisive Battle of El Alamein was won not just on the battlefield, but also in the waters of the Mediterranean. It was a victory for the anonymous sailors and airmen who choked the Axis supply line, one ship at a time. What logistical secrets are still undiscovered? Were there secret Axis supply routes, perhaps using submarines or long-range aircraft, that were more successful than official histories suggest? How much of the supply problem was due to corruption or inefficiency in the Italian ports, an issue often hinted at in German reports? Did the British have spies inside the Italian Navy who provided intelligence on convoy movements, and have their identities ever been revealed? Number 3, how did a colossal failure launch the world's most famous special force? The Special Air Service, or SAS, is now a legendary name, but its beginning was anything but glorious. It started with a disaster. The idea for the SAS came from a young, unconventional officer named David Stirling. In the summer of 1941, he was in a hospital in Cairo, recovering from a parachuting accident. He had a lot of time to think. He realized that a small group of highly trained men, dropped by parachute behind enemy lines, could do a huge amount of damage. They could attack airfields, destroy planes on the ground, and disappear into the desert before the enemy even knew what had happened. A few men could do the work of an entire bomber squadron at a fraction of the cost. It was a radical idea, and the military command was skeptical. But Stirling was persuasive. He managed to get approval to form a small unit of about 60 men. He called it L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, to make it sound like a much larger force and confuse enemy intelligence. The men he recruited were tough, independent, and disciplined. They began to train in the desert, practicing parachute jumps and sabotage techniques. Their first real mission, codenamed Operation Squatter, was planned for November 1941. The target was 5 enemy airfields deep in Libya. The plan was to parachute in during a storm, blow up as many planes as possible, and then walk to a rendezvous point to be picked up by the WWII. The mission was a complete and utter catastrophe. The storm they parachuted into was far worse than expected. There was a gale force wind mixed with torrential rain. The men were scattered all over the desert. Many were injured on landing. Their equipment was lost. They were soaked, freezing, and completely disoriented. They couldn't find the airfields. They couldn't find each other. Of the 55 men who jumped, only 21 made it back. The rest were killed or captured. It was an unmitigated disaster. Any normal commander would have been fired, and the unit disbanded. But Stirling was not a normal commander. As told in books like The Phantom Major by Virginia Cowles, he looked at the failure and drew the right lesson. The problem wasn't the idea of small raiding parties. The problem was the method of delivery. Parachuting into the desert was too risky and too dependent on the weather. There was a better way. The WWII could drive them. From that point on, the SAS changed its tactics. They would be transported by the WWII to a point near their target. They would then walk the final few miles, place their custom-made, loose bomb explosives on the enemy aircraft, and slip away into the night. This new method was incredibly successful. Over the next year, the SAS destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft on the ground. The disastrous first raid, which should have been the end of the SAS, instead became its foundation. It forced them to adapt and innovate, creating the template for Special Forces operations that is still used today. What details of this first mission are lost to history? What were the final moments like for the men who were captured or killed? And do any German or Italian records of their capture exist? How did David Stirling manage to convince his superiors to give him a second chance after such a costly failure? Were there any dissenting voices within the original SAS unit who believed Stirling's ideas were reckless, and what happened to them? Number 2, what happened after the surrender? The Desert War produced a huge number of prisoners of war on both sides. After a big battle, tens of thousands of men might be captured in a single day. For these soldiers, the war was over, but a new struggle for survival was just beginning. The first stop for a captured soldier was usually a temporary holding cage in the desert. These were simple enclosures made of barbed wire. Conditions were often appalling. There was little shelter from the sun, and water and food were scarce. The captors, who were often struggling with their own supply problems, could only provide the bare minimum. For the vast number of Italian and German soldiers captured by the Allies after major victories like El Alamein and the final surrender in Tunisia, the journey into captivity was long and arduous. They were marched or transported in crowded trucks to large, permanent POW camps in Egypt near the Suez Canal. These camps, like Geneva, held hundreds of thousands of men. Life in the camps was a mixture of boredom, hardship, and routine. The prisoners were housed in tents, fed a basic diet, and put to work on various projects. The experience is documented in memoirs and historical studies, such as Axis Prisoners of War in the United States by Arnold Kramer, which also touches on the camps in other Allied territories. The psychological toll was immense. These were men who had been soldiers, and now they were just numbers in a system. They were cut off from their families and had no idea when they would go home. But they also created their own communities within the wire. They organized sports, classes, and theater groups. They ran their own kitchens and workshops. The camps became small cities, with their own internal politics and social structures. There were tensions, of course, between different nationalities and between officers and enlisted men. The experience of Allied prisoners in Axis hands was often much worse. While the Desert War is sometimes remembered for a certain chivalry, this did not always extend to the treatment of prisoners. Allied prisoners captured by the Italians were often transported to camps in Italy where conditions were poor. Those captured by the Germans faced a similar fate, though treatment could vary widely depending on the camp. The supply problems that plagued the Axis armies also affected their prisoners, meaning food was often scarce. The journey itself could be deadly. Many Allied POWs being transported across the Mediterranean on Italian ships died when those ships were sunk by British submarines, a tragic irony of the war. The story of the POWs is a quieter, less dramatic part of the war, but it affected hundreds of thousands of lives. It was a long, slow war of waiting. What are the great unknowns of the POW experience? How many prisoners on both sides died in the initial desert holding pens from wounds, dehydration, or disease? Their deaths never properly recorded. What covert intelligence gathering operations did the Allies run inside their own POW camps to identify valuable prisoners or gather information? What stories of friendship and cooperation between prisoners and their guards have gone untold? Number 1, was there honor among enemies in the sand? The North African campaign has a strange reputation. For all its brutality, it is often called the war without hate. There are countless stories of a kind of chivalry, a mutual respect between the soldiers of the 8th Army and the Afrika Korps. This idea is a central theme in many historical accounts. Is it true? To some extent, yes, the desert was a clean battlefield. It was vast and empty. There were no towns or villages to be destroyed, no civilians caught in the crossfire, though the local Libyan and Egyptian populations certainly suffered. The fight was between soldiers. This created a different kind of war. There are documented cases of both sides leaving water for the enemy's wounded. There are stories of patrols stumbling upon each other in the vast emptiness, sharing a cigarette, and then going their separate ways, a kind of unspoken truce in the middle of nowhere. After a battle, medical teams would often treat the wounded from both sides without distinction. The German commander, Erwin Rommel, was respected, almost admired, by his British opponents for his skill and daring. This mutual respect was born out of a shared experience. Both sides were fighting not just each other, but the brutal desert environment. They understood what the other was going through, the heat, the thirst, the flies, the isolation. However, it's important not to romanticize this. The war was still incredibly violent and deadly. Men were killed in brutal, terrifying ways. Tanks were brewed up, incinerating their crews. The artillery bombardments were devastating. No quarter was given in the heat of battle. And this chivalry did not always extend to everyone. And Italian soldiers, for example, were often looked down upon by both the British and their German allies. The idea of the clean war is largely a narrative constructed after the fact, a way of making sense of the chaos and finding humanity in the midst of slaughter. The reality was more complex. It was a mixture of brutal combat and occasional moments of shared humanity. As military historian Matthew Parker has explored, the line between myth and reality in the Desert War is often blurred. Perhaps the most famous story is that of Captain Hans Joachim Marseille, a German fighter ace. He was known for his incredible skill, but also for his humane treatment of the pilots he shot down. If a pilot bailed out over German lines, Marseille would often fly over to make sure he was captured safely and not harmed by troops on the ground. When Marseille himself was killed in a flying accident, his opponents in the Desert Air Force reportedly felt a genuine sense of loss for a respected adversary. These stories are not typical of warfare. They are unique to the strange, isolated, and starkly beautiful theater of the desert. It was a place where two modern industrial armies met in an ancient landscape, and for a brief moment, they sometimes saw the humanity in their enemy. But what fundamental truths about this honor do we still not understand? How much of the Without Hate narrative was a post-war construction created by veterans and historians to give a cleaner, more noble meaning to a brutal conflict? Were there widespread but unrecorded war crimes and atrocities committed in the desert that have been conveniently forgotten by history? Did this code of conduct break down completely in the final desperate battles in Tunisia? And if so, why is that part of the story so rarely told?